Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just delighted to see so many of you here, given the circumstances. Welcome and thank you very much. I know that many of you, like me, are delighted to be in a place that has air conditioning. So we're part of this move to kind of regularize things on campus and get ourselves back on some kind of schedule, despite the challenges of doing so. So thank you very much for helping us in that endeavor. I am Susan McIntosh, and I am Director of Scientia, and we are very excited by our biopolitics theme this year. I hope that you will be as well, and that we'll see you at a number of our lectures. Beyond this one, I'm sure you've seen our fall lineup. We're going to, during the year, have a couple of lectures that relate to the theme of neuroscience and law, which is really one of the themes that got us going this year, seeing the neuro law cover article in the New York Times Magazine a few months back, and understanding that biological sciences and politics, the legal system, ethics, a lot of these questions are intersecting in very interesting and vital ways for our future. So we decided to take a look at that, and we've been extremely fortunate not just to have this lineup with David Eagleman from Baylor College of Medicine's neuroscience and brain and ethics and the law initiative over at Baylor coming to speak, but our Bachner lecturer in the spring is going to be Nicholas Rose from the London School of Economics, who is also embarking on a major project involving the legal system and neuroscience. So we're covering a number of fields. We're also going to be having in the spring, in February, putting together a panel on the politics of teaching evolution in Texas, which is a very timely matter since Texas is redefining its science curricular standards this year. Medical ethics, many of the topics that we're talking about, I think you're going to find very interesting. Neil Lane will be speaking in January on how scientists can work effectively with policymakers, despite the rather vast gulf that sometimes seems to separate scientific knowledge from some of our policymakers. So I hope that you will join us at various points during this year. Would also like to point out that we have the DeLange Conference coming up in the spring, and it is actively underway with a full program planned. You can pick up a brochure at the table outside near the reception table afterwards if you have not done so already. This conference will be on transforming the metropolis, creating sustainable and humane cities, and it promises to be an even bigger success than the previous DeLange Conference on emerging libraries. I'm also going to hope that many of the students who might be in class have picked up a response form to tell us how you came to hear about this lecture, and that you'll put them in the box outside afterwards. If you haven't gotten a form before coming in, please pick one up at the end, fill it out, and drop it in the box. That helps us a lot. All right. I think that was everything that I needed to say at the beginning before getting to the real reason that we're here, which is our lecturer today, Professor John Alford. He received a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Houston, and a master's and a PhD in political science from the University of Iowa. His earlier published work was mostly in the area of elections and voting behavior, with an emphasis on the American Congress, but his interests have always been eclectic, and he's published in areas as diverse as coal mine safety and pro-natalist policies in Eastern Europe. He's also been active as a consultant and an expert witness in the area of redistricting and election law. In 2001, he served as the redistricting expert for the state of Texas and assisted the federal court in drawing the 2002 Texas congressional districts. Professor Alford's current research focuses on the biology of political behavior and he is currently collaborating on 3 NSF-funded projects exploring the biology of politics with a team that includes political scientists, behavioral geneticists, neuroscientists, and clinical neuropsychologists located at the Baylor College of Medicine's Human Neuroimaging Lab, the University of Nebraska, the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, Virginia Commonwealth University, and the University of Minnesota. This has been very exciting research that you may have already read about. It was published fairly widely in the media not too long ago. And the title of his talk is Politics in Our Genes, the Biology of Ideology. Help me in welcoming Professor Alford.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and the update on the series, because I'm looking forward to the year. There are a lot of really interesting people coming, and so I guess the one soonest will be David Eagleman, who I highly recommend to you. He's one of the brightest, most fascinating people that I've ever met, and nothing he says is anything except fascinating, so you should see that. By all means, it may reinvigorate your interest in the field after hearing what I have to say. So I'd like to, one of the things that, the other thing you mentioned that I thought was interesting was about evolution in Texas. As many of you may know, the United States, one of the most educated, advanced scientific countries in the world, has one of the highest proportions of adults who do not believe that humans evolved from primates. So we actually outstrip many other countries that you might think might have a lower rate of non-belief. In fact, of the countries surveyed, we're the only country in which a majority of the adult population does not believe in evolution in the sense that humans evolved from some other life form. I think that's a fairly astonishing observation, but it's not the most astonishing to me. What's the most astonishing to me is that the 49% of adult Americans who believe in evolution apparently believe in a very unusual form of evolution, in which we basically evolved from some primates and then in the process immediately shed everything which characterizes evolution in every other species. That is that we have no trace of this change other than the fact that we apparently in some internal organ sense resemble primates. So that for example, the mechanism by which evolution takes place, the alteration and selection of genetic material appears not to play much of a role in sort of what we consider to be our human nature. And that's really what I want to address, and although the topic of the discussion here will be mostly human political behavior and ideology, because I'm a political scientist, so I own that territory. I'm defending it very hard against neuroeconomists, against cognitive psychologists. If you know much about political science, we're something like France. We're kind of France had great food and culture and so forth, but it was kind of weakly defended. Political science has spectacular territory, right? What we intend to explain is really what makes humans humans, right? We intend to explain how the large-scale social life, non-kin social life, is possible and the characteristics of that. This is vastly important territory, but we do a remarkably poor job of actually doing the science for it, and so other disciplines, psychology, sociology, economics, routinely invade political science and take our subject matter and typically do a better job of it than we've done. And so the neuroeconomists and cognitive psychologists are banging at the door, and I'm just trying to stay at least roughly even with them. Well, one of the things that I think is involved in taking this notion seriously, that we are in fact sort of evolved characters, is taking the notion that some part of human behavior has origins or relevant influences in biology, and ultimately that means that there is some connection to human behavior in genetics. And I want to begin by, eventually I'll use this PowerPoint thing, which I hate, and I'll use it briefly and then I'll stop using it because I hate it. I use it only because I'm weak and fallible, and so and I've given in to to computer envy or something, and you just have to have a PowerPoint, and so I've sinned and I have a PowerPoint, and she'll discover later I'm not very, like most people, I'm not very good at actually making the thing go forward or backward, so we'll get to go through all that fumbling around stuff. But for you students who may have had me in a class, you'll know the real reason I don't like PowerPoint is that digression is extremely difficult with PowerPoint. The sort of creation of new and completely unrelated slides on the go is really quite difficult. And so I always have a PowerPoint, and I feel like I have to give the lecture I made a PowerPoint. And by the time I'm done, with the 800 or 900 hours it takes me to create a PowerPoint, I have no interest in that particular lecture anymore. And so I'll touch on some of that, but I really want to talk a little bit about, about some things that are really more about genetics and human behavior than they are strictly about politics, but there's a lot of human behavior, as much as I like politics, that's outside of the realm of politics, so this applies in general. To the extent that people believe that genetics has any relevance for human behavior, they typically think of that in terms of human universals. So just as we think of the kind of universals of our physical structure as being related to that nice, durable genetic material that we have, we tend to think of behavioral universals, the fact that humans universally have language, that humans universally have music, that humans universally have some sort of hierarchical structure, that they have some sort of spiritual belief, some sense of things beyond themselves. These kinds of things that we see both across all cultures and across all times. We say, well, these are human universals. And to the extent that we're in the 49% that accept the notion of a kind of genetic or evolutionary influence, we tend to think of it as it's the universals that are influenced by that, and then everything else is basically environmentally determined or culturally determined, or as a result of free will. So if you think about that, this fits very nicely, as we're all aware, that with the fact that 99.9% of all human genetic material is identical across humans. This is a very reassuring statistic if you don't believe that human genetic material is of any real importance to the world, right? Because after all, we evolve very slowly. So as long as we have some universals, and we can tip our hat to biology, to evolution, to genetics, and say, my God, if it wasn't for evolution, we wouldn't have our natural appreciation of music, or we wouldn't have our natural skill for language. And so in that sense, we're not blank slates in the Steven Pinker sense. We accept that we're not blank slates, but while accepting that we're not blank slates, we are pretty insistent on the fact that we all have the same non-blank slate. Right? So there's something written on the slate, and it's exactly the same thing for every one of us. And it's some things about kind of human universals. This is very reassuring because it allows you to believe in this, and then beyond believing in it, it has absolutely no real-world impact on anything else that you do, say, think, or believe. Right? So you basically can isolate this. This becomes a fog fact. It's something you know is true, but has no relevance for anything else we're interested in. So, for example, we're as social scientists, we're interested in variables, right? Things that vary. Well, the stuff that varies can't be the result of the genetics because it doesn't vary, right? 99.9% the same, and change over time is very slow, so we can safely ignore it. Here's the problem with that. First of all, the 99.9% is a made-up number. This is something that, for those of you who think social sciences make up numbers and the hard sciences derive them through that difficult process known as mathematics, you would, for example, might believe that the 99.9% came from some long division problem, something you vaguely remember being able to do at some stage, but if you're on my side of campus, you certainly wouldn't want to be pressed on that. So that long division would require that you had the numerator and denominator. That is, you knew how much genetic material there was, and then how much was shared, and then you could do that division. But it may surprise you to know that division hasn't actually been done. That's just a pretty good guess of what it probably has to be if things are kind of the way we think they are. All right? So what I want to talk about is not about universals and genes, which I think is interesting, and there's lots of work being done in that area, but as a social scientist, I need things to vary, and universals don't vary, so I can't really study them. You can make up stories about them. This is, for those of you familiar with evolutionary psychology, substantial proportion of that is very cleverly made up stories. this is what social scientists are the very best at doing. I don't mean to single out evolutionary psychologists. They're just doing what all of us social scientists do and make a living doing on a daily basis, which is make up really incredibly clever stories that we sometimes call theories, sometimes we call them conclusions, but it's basically the same thing. So what I want to talk about is things that vary across humans and the role of genetics in influencing human variability. Differences in humans that arise not simply from cultural differences or life experience differences or your exercise of free will, but differences in human behavior that differentiate across humans and that are traceable to genetic factors, right? So that means, in one sense, that I basically want to function in that 0.1% of the genetic difference between humans. And so I need to say something a little bit about that fills that in a little bit. That this largely shared genome that we supposedly have is constructed of, or the human genome is really got two pieces to it. It's got a piece that consists of genes, of which there are about 25,000. There used to be 100,000, then there were 80,000, then there were 50,000, and then there were 30,000, and now we're someplace south of 25,000. We don't know exactly what the number is, but every time somebody has come out with the new, we're pretty sure about it, the number has dropped dramatically. This is putting us, as you might know, getting pretty close to the territory of the roundworm. There's a lot of difference. This is where I think you've got to really draw the line here. It's true that in a certain number of genes we're pretty close to the roundworm, but there are a lot of differences between humans and roundworms that I think are important. And some of those are physical differences, and some of those are behavioral differences. And there's a lot going on in the genes that accounts for the physical differences, and I think there's also a lot that accounts for the behavioral difference. Interestingly enough, this diminishing number of genes, that is, stretches of base code in DNA that actually encode proteins, this diminishing number of genes actually occupies a very small part of our very large genome. So in terms of base pairs, we've got this very long genome, and again, these are estimates, but the current estimate is something between 3 and 5% of the entire human genome, that is of all the DNA on your chromosomes, is actually contained in those strips that are encoding genes. What's the other 95 to 97% doing? Nothing. It's there's a technical term for this. What's the technical term? Junk DNA. Boy, this has got hubris written all over it, okay? So, and of course you might be interested to know, how much junk DNA do roundworms have? Almost none, okay? Almost none. So very little junk DNA. If you get down to single-celled life, you virtually no junk DNA at all. As complexity goes up, number of genes goes up, but sort of, arithmetically, right, just small increases, but amount of junk DNA has this wonderful sort of logarithmic rise as you move into really complex creatures like us. So now, I'm not a geneticist by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm going to just make a wild guess here that all of that stuff in the junk DNA is not junk. It's actually encoding for complexity, so that evolution, which is an amazingly parsimonious process, did not just load us up with a whole bunch of code that means nothing at all. It loaded us up with a whole bunch of code that doesn't do what DNA is supposed to do, because we know from the dogma of genetics that DNA is supposed to code for protein, and this stuff doesn't code for proteins, and we can probably safely ignore it. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going on out there. And that is where this is going to lead. All right, so the study of human behavior is going to lead us into that part of the genome that creatures not unlike us, that is, creatures who have roughly the same ratio of white to gray matter in their brain, which is humans, whales, elephants, things like that, primates. The study of behavior in that realm is going to lead us into what we share with those other creatures, which is a lot of junk DNA. And there's a couple of things about junk DNA that are useful to remember. One is that unlike the real DNA, the stuff that encodes proteins, junk DNA is highly variable. It is not exactly the same across all of humans. So here's an example. We're going to have to get to twins at some point anyway, so let's do something with twins. You're familiar with what are called identical twins. They are technically monozygotic twins because, of course, they come from a single zygote, and they are clones. Okay, if you ever wondered if cloning is a good idea, I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but the world is full of clones. There are thousands of them born every day. They're called monozygotic twins. They are clones, right? So there's a single embryo. It begins developing into a single human being. It forms a blastosphere sometime in around 48 cells for reasons no one understands. It suddenly loses coherence, splits apart, typically splits in two, but can split into 3, 4, 5, etc. And then these go on to produce separate individuals. Those separate individuals are genetic clones. They share 100% of their, at origin, 100% of genetic material. That's, again, that's standard genetic dogma of MZ twins. Do MZ twins have junk DNA that's identical? Their protein encoding DNA is identical. This is, for, among other things, the reason why they look identical. But of course, we all know they don't act identical, and one of the reasons they don't act identically is because all of our behavior as humans is influenced by environment, culture, upbringing, and free will. There couldn't be any differences between them that had any genetic origin because they are genetic clones, except that they in fact share, while they share the exact same coding DNA, they don't share the exact same non-coding DNA, the so-called junk DNA. So there are substantial copy number variations between identical twins. If there are substantial copy number variations between identical twins, how much might there be between non-identical twins? Quite a bit. How much might there be between humans scattered across the face of the earth? A lot. There's an enormous amount of variation in this non-coding DNA. And it's in this non-coding DNA that we find the genetic sources of human behavior. Well, that said, and in order to get to voles, we do have to begin the presentation. Let's see where we go here. Now here we are. This is why I love PowerPoint. It allows you to put up small tables full of small numbers that no one can actually make any sense out of, but that's all right. This is where my work in this area starts. It starts with basically stealing data from some other people, fortunately with their permission, and basically telling the political science audience something that behavioral geneticists have known for 20 years, which is that a remarkable range of human attitudes are highly heritable. Right, so if we look down this list, you can see this, in the center of the list you have a heritability estimate where that says 0.41. That's 0.41 out of 1. So roughly 40% of the variation, in this sample at least, of twins in attitude towards school prayer is traceable to a genetic component, a heritable component. About 25% is, if you move along that top line, is traced to shared environment. Shared environment is parental upbringing, the schools you went to, the neighborhood you grew up in, and all those kinds of things that as a family or as siblings you would share together. And then unshared environment is sort of the outside world. Well, if you go all the way down to the bottom, what you'll see is that across these attitudes, and they range, from fairly important things to things I would think are not particularly important, like astrology. If you look at that across the board, what you see is about a third of this human variation is traceable to genetic inheritance. This shows about 16%, so some much smaller fraction traced to shared environment, and then approximately half unshared environment. There are two things about this that should strike anybody well versed in the social sciences as dramatic. The first has nothing to do with genetic heritability at all. It's simply the relative role of shared versus unshared environment. So these are individuals, I'll tell you a little bit about the sample. It's a sample of twins, and there are, of course, two kinds of twins. One we already know, identical monozygotic twins. The other is dizygotic twins. Dizygotic twins are not clones at all. They are, in my view, not even twins. They are simply siblings. They're siblings. They are no more alike genetically than any two other siblings born of the same set of parents. They reflect separate eggs and separate sperm, so they're just like any other siblings. But luckily for us, they are siblings born at exactly the same time, or pretty close to each other. I have dizygotic twins, so they're a few minutes in there, but they're pretty much, for all intents and purposes, they're born about the same time. Now, when we're looking at siblings then, and we talk about shared versus unshared environment, everything that a pair of siblings born at the same time would share together growing up is what shared environment is. So they obviously share the same parents, they share the same home, they go to similar types of schools, often to exactly the same classrooms through at least elementary school. In their house, there are the same books, there's the same emphasis on music. They grow up at the same period of time in history, so if they were born during the Depression, they were both born during the Depression. All of the things from parental to family, to church, to school, to point in history, to the country, to growing up. If lucky enough they grow up in Texas like my twins, spectacular good luck to be Texans. They're both Texans, right? All of those things, all of those environmental influences are part of the shared environment. The unshared environment are the things which these two siblings, born at the same time, in the same family, raised in the same family, would not share. Right? So these are things like adult experience, the kinds of things that happen to them typically after they've left, or unique events, like one of them got beat up at school and the other didn't, or something like that. As social scientists, we've largely focused on the shared environment. That is, this shared environment is what we would call socialization. So this is where we think most of the action happens. So if you believe that culture is important, clearly they're not, the two non-identical twins are not experiencing different cultures growing up. They're immersed not only in the same culture broadly, as in sort of Western democracy, but very narrowly, as in like Western Baytown. Okay, so all of the influences we think are powerful turn out, at least for these attitudes, to be actually not very powerful at all, and for some of them apparently not influential at all. An unshared environment is much more important. That doesn't depend on any understanding of genetics or giving any role to genetics. That alone makes you rethink the way you think about people's political attitudes. And so adult political attitudes, how much of that has to do with the fact that you grew up in the Depression in an upper middle class family in which reading books was really important, in which both of your parents were liberals and for a brief time part of the Communist Party, in which you went to Catholic schools and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Not very much. Not very much. Most of it is accounted for by either unique adult experiences in which you actually go out in the world and experience things uniquely, or at a rate approximately twice shared environment, heritability, that is actual genetic predisposition to orient yourselves toward attitudes in some particular way. So what this is in sum is this is a very different way of thinking about humans, and particularly a different way of thinking about things like human ideology or political beliefs. So do you get political beliefs from your parents? To a substantial degree, you do get some influence from your parents, and most of that influence takes place very early. Very early as in the conception. Okay, that's really, so if you're thinking about sort of, what was your dad's role in making you a conservative? Your dad's role was, 2 to 7 minutes of vigorous physical activity. And after that, the rest of it is pretty much, there's that little 10% or whatever that's left there for parental pride of some sort. One of the things I think that is most important about this is to simultaneously think about this as providing some degree of hubris. Right? So when we set out to change the way people are, or to fix the things that have happened to them that are bad or whatever, how much influence do we think we have? We think we basically have something close to 100%, and the fact is we just don't. So part of what we have to have is a little bit of hubris when we think that we can fix everything, change everything, whatever. There are real limits to what we can do in re-engineering human beings. And when you have possibilities like things like the Cultural Revolution, that may not be a bad thing to have a little bit of hubris. The other thing is I think it allows you to set a reasonable target. So if you're engaged in some social program that is socially responsible, as you should be, what do you define as success? If you define success as saying here's a problem and we're going to make 100% difference. Well, for these kinds of things, if you're talking about changing people's basic nature, if you're on a crusade to make everyone, my brother for example, thinks it would be a good idea if everybody could have just for a moment stop and realize that basically far right-wing conservatism is genius and that everything else is nonsense, and he would like to see the world changed and people enlightened because he cares about people and he feels sorry for liberals and he would like to do something about it. Well, how could he define success? If he defines success as making everybody realize what he realizes, which is basic conservative beliefs are correct and the other stuff is kind of silly, then he's not going to get there. Right? The amount we're able to push around is remarkably less robust than what we think. And so we have to define success in social programs that are directed at things like changing people's ideas about the way things should be at a much lower level. There's what we might consider to be a failure may in fact be a spectacular success given the range of variance we have to work with. All right. And this is my very favorite quote. It's from a very dear person who hates me, Evan Charney at Duke University. does not like this research, believes the research is entirely bogus, has no use for it at all. But in a published critique of the work, this is what he said. The claim of Alford, Funk, and Hibbing, those are my co-authors, Carrie Funk, VCU, and John Hibbing, University of Nebraska, is indeed astonishing because if true, the if true is really important for him and not that important for me. I thought about putting ellipses there. It would require nothing less than a revision of our understanding of all human history, much if not most of political science, sociology, anthropology, and psychology, as well as perhaps our understanding of what it means to be a human. Now, for a political scientist, this is a really interesting thing to have somebody say because political science really rarely changes much of political science. As anybody in sociology or anthropology or psychology can tell you, political science never changes anything in those disciplines, right? Those disciplines change us all the time, but we don't contribute to changing the way people think in psychology or political science. I notice that economics is not in here because it's not, as even Evan recognizes, it's not possible to change the doctrine in economics no matter what the discovery. So, but then sort of to throw in there as the sort of the teaser, the understanding of what it means to be a human, I just think we should just retire because even if this is just possible, this is so far beyond the wildest dreams of anybody in political science. I spent 20 years studying incumbency advantage in U.S. congressional elections, mostly midterm elections, and no one ever said, if true, this work could change what it means to be an incumbent in a congressional midterm election. So I think this is we should just look at this for a while and just stop. But of course, in fairness, I have to mention two things. First of all, this claim is, of course, not our claim at all. We're just introducing to political science a claim from behavioral genetics made 20 years ago by other people far more skilled at behavioral genetics than we are, particularly Lyndon Eves and Nick Martin. And so it's not really our idea or our demonstration or our claim for that matter. And then second, of course, that Evan Charney believes that everything we've done is completely without merit. So if you factor those two things in, there's really not much here for us to be proud of, but still. But there it is, my favorite quote. All right, so I'm claiming that lots of stuff is heritable, meaning lots of stuff has the genetic variation across humans actually contribute something to variation in other kinds of things. These things that are listed here are what we call phenotypes. Phenotypes, that's the fancy terminology meant to exclude most people from understanding what we do. And phenotypes are nothing more than just, the sort of ultimate expressions, either physical things like, having attached earlobes or some behavioral trait. So what's heritable? Happiness, education, musical ability, divorce, extroversion, openness, religiosity, leisure interests, the kinds of stuff you like to do. There's one of the best and most precise genetic studies that's come out in the last 5 years on behavior is a study of people who pursue dancing as a major in college. Turns out to be not just that there's heritability to this, but there's an actual gene that's related to dance performance. I think it's the idea that people who study dance performance could have gotten ahead of all the rest of the social sciences is a pretty humiliating indictment of where we are these days. Not to disparage the rest of the research on performance dance, which is, I'm sure, very high quality. Occupational interest, job satisfaction, criminal convictions, drug and alcohol dependence, autism, and then, of course, most controversial, IQ. Now, just because this happens to be more broadly studied for IQ than anything else, I'm presenting you an IQ table. I have done no studies of the heritability of IQ, and so we're not going to discuss that potentially explosive topic of the possibility that the physical condition of your brain might somehow affect your intelligence level. But because it's the most extensively studied, it allows us to do a kind of a check on whether, sort of broadly speaking, twin studies work. And so let me just very, very quickly, without getting into a lot of detail that we don't need, twin studies basically take advantage of the fact that these two different types of twins are siblings born at the same time, and that MZ twins are siblings born at the same time that have essentially identical genetic material, and DZ twins, that is non-identical twins, are siblings born at the same time that share 50% of their genetic material. That difference, the 150%, provide the mathematical engine that drives a process in which you can actually address how much is genetic. So that to the extent that, in a nutshell, to the extent that MZ twins are more alike than DZ twins, it's probably a result of genetics, since they otherwise should be equally similar in terms of their environment. So does this actually work? Well, one way to check that is to look at the Dutch twin study on the bottom. This is a Dutch twin study that works exactly the way our study of political ideology works. It takes the difference between MZ and DZ twins, runs them through a set of equations called Volcker equations, and comes out with estimates for genetic, shared environment, and unshared environment. And what they're looking at here is making those estimations across age groups, right? So if you look at the beginning sort of the graph, what you see there is that the effect of genetics is relatively low. So genetics is the line that'll eventually end up on the top, and shared environment actually starts out higher. So when you're 5 years old, how important is genetics versus shared environment? Well, as anybody who's ever had a 5-year-old, I have just recently had a couple of them before they turned 6. An environment has a lot to do with how smart 6-year-olds are. If you put them in an enriched environment and force them to read and all those kinds of things that as good parents we do, then they are smart as whips, every one of them, right? So they're just like the Iowa, right? They're all above average. And genetics really isn't that important. And then what you see happens in this twin study is that by the time you get to 12 years of age, shared environment has no influence at all on IQ, and genetics is now accounting for something far more substantial, close to 80 or 90% of intelligence. Well, that's a pretty remarkable finding, I think, and would lead me, given my deep faith in the environment, to not believe in twin studies, quite frankly. I just don't think that's a plausible explanation, that basically at sometime around age 12, shared environment is gone and genetics just rips in and takes over everything. So look at the graph above it, which is a U.S. adoption study. This has nothing to do with twins. There are no twins in the study. This simply compares the correlation between the adoptive parents and the offspring to the correlation between the biological parents and the offspring. And what you'll see there is that initially the correlation is higher for is roughly in the same range for the two. There's actually a period there between 2 and 4 when the influence of the adopted family is higher than the influence of the biological parents. But you'll also notice that at age 12, the influence of the adoptive family, the correlation between the IQ of the adoptive parents and the child drops to 0. And at that time, the correlation between the biological parents and the children level off basically at about 0.3, which is about what we estimate, for example, for political ideology. And so what do the two studies suggest? The two studies suggest that there is a substantial role for genetics, and that the role of environment, at least in IQ, is something that is apparent early when environment can be important and then disappears largely by age 12. The fact that is apparent in both studies, one of which is a twin study and one of which has nothing to do with twins at all, one of which is a correlation between siblings in IQ, and one of which is a correlation between parents and offspring in IQ, is really rather remarkable. So I think this indicates that you can place at least some faith in twin studies, and that we have to take the notion that behavior is genetically influenced seriously. This is a graph of ideology now. We switched to ideology. This is the heritability of ideology, and basically what's going on here is that the red line is DZ twins and the black line is MZ twins, so identical twins. If something is heritable, identical twins should be more alike than DZ twins, and in fact what you see is in adults, that is everybody over the age of 20, that's the case. That in adults you see MZ twins being much more alike than DZ twins, but that's not true for anybody under the age of 20. What this means is that there is essentially no heritable component, genetic heritable component for ideology in adolescents or young adults. So that what's going on with, if you wonder why 17-year-olds have particular ideological beliefs, they have them mostly because of shared environment or parental influence. If you want to know why, as adults, they have certain values, the influence of genetics is much larger. So if you're parents and you're despairing about the possibility for ever getting your kids to be correct ideologically, don't despair until they're at least 25 years old. Okay? If at 25 they don't share your ideology, then you just have to accept the fact that you had your shot, your 30% or so that you could do, plus a little bit of the 10 or 15% in shared environment, and you just missed the mark. The odds were against you. More than half the variance was outside adult stuff anyway, so you did what you could. and you kept them, you know, at least basically correct for a while, and now they're off on their own, and they're gone. And of course, if that's if you're a mother. If you're a father, I think I'd start asking questions about paternity, because there's a substantial chance that you really had no dog in this fight from the very beginning. That you were just really you were wasting your time as far as your child's ideology was concerned. This is in the studies that actually study parent-child correlations. This is a serious issue, because when they study this, one of the things they started doing was blood typing the parents and the children to make sure, right? Because if your control group is biological parents, it's important that they be biological parents. And the mothers are pretty clear on this. So that, you know, that's, yeah, I had the baby, or I remember having that baby, right? So that contribution is pretty clear. The father's is much vaguer, right? It's sort of like, I remember being in the area around, you know, 9 months before, vaguely, or something like that. And when they actually do this typing, particularly in urban areas, may not surprise any of you who live in large urban areas. In large urban areas, a substantial proportion, in some areas approaching 20%, of intact families in which the father believes themselves to be the biological parent, they are not the biological parent of at least one of their offspring. So this is, you know, was a real eye-opener for me. Anyway. All right, so we've got some reasonably believable data that connects genotypes to phenotypes, right? So there's somehow this variable genetic material, most of which is in what geneticists would call junk DNA, and has recently been discovered to be fairly powerful, important, controlling stuff. We've got genes that ultimately relate to political ideology. How do we connect them? So sort of having established those endpoints is really just what makes the rest of the study worthwhile. So what we as a research team want to do is we want to make the biological connection. We're interested in the biology that sits between genes, which ultimately I think are not very interesting, and behavior, which I think is quite interesting, and you've got to make that connection. There's no point in trying to make the connection if there's no heritability. If you find things that have no heritability, there's no point in spending all the time and money chasing the biology. If you do find heritability, then it's up to you to actually show how that might take place and why it might matter. So this is, you know, genes don't build behaviors. There's not a gene for some little behavior, but genes do build brains, and brains have something to do with behavior. So we do have a central nervous system, and we have a connection between genes in that central nervous system, and then we have a connection between the central nervous system and behavior. That's why at present what we're studying is we are studying genes, so we're taking blood from people and genotyping people, but we're also spending a lot of time over at Baylor imaging people's brains, and we're spending a lot of time in Nebraska monitoring people's physiology. So our most recent work actually concerns just simple physiology. It's basically how hard do you blink if someone makes a loud noise. So, you know, if I was to make I think if that doesn't work, but if I say had the sense to bring a firecracker with me and set it off here, there would be a loud noise and you would startle. Humans do this pretty much universally, so I don't find that to be very interesting. Humans have auditory startle. Does this seem like a mystery to you? It's, you know, I don't care whether you believe in evolution or what you believe in. This just doesn't seem mysterious that we have auditory startle. Although interestingly, not everything that's alive has auditory startle. Even things that have auditory systems don't necessarily have auditory startle, but we do. So if you come up behind us and make a really loud noise, we jump. And not only do we jump, but we blink. And this is really important for us because it's kind of hard to follow people around and measure their jump. But it's although still quite hard, it's not impossible to put little sensors underneath people's eyes that are subocular blink responder devices, and they then connect up to some kind of probes that you plug into computers, and out comes this nice, clean measure of how hard you blink. And it turns out this is a nice measure of physiology, in part because this blink response is actually in part controlled by the amygdala, which has to do with how we respond to stress, fear, and a lot of other things. Like all parts of the brain, it does basically apparently everything, but in part it has something to do with this involuntary blink response. And we know that amygdala is involved in other kinds of issues about sort of how prepared people are for, how defensive people are prepared for defense, how responsive they are to outside threat. So we've actually measured this blink response, and based on the blink response, guess what we can predict about you? We can predict your left-right orientation. There's a substantial, statistically significant difference in blink response to auditory startle between liberals and conservatives. And who is it that blinks the hardest, liberals or conservatives? How many of you think it's liberals? How many of you think it's conservatives? How many of you liberals think it's conservatives? And how many of you conservatives think it's liberals? This is, you know, this is what I like about, this is what I like to make fun of about evolutionary psychology, right? So I got an evolutionary story for why liberals would blink harder. I've got an evolutionary story for why conservatives would blink harder. I've got an evolutionary story for why nobody would blink harder. I've got an evolutionary story for why we wouldn't blink at all. So basically, and they're all good stories, they're all believable stories, and they all take place in the Pleistocene, an era in which we know basically nothing at all about human behavior, specifically about eye blink, auditory startle in the Pleistocene. I don't know, but we know that we were hunter-gatherers and we, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know the stories. They're wonderful. You should read them. I think they're some of the most entertaining work being done in the social sciences. I don't believe a word of it, but it's beautiful stuff. It's great literature. So, what is it actually? It is actually conservatives that blink the hardest. Conservatives, in a particular sense, not conservatives on economic issues or necessarily conservatives on social moral issues, but conservatives on issues like immigration, national defense. So when it comes to outgroup alertness and when it comes to sort of protectiveness, conservatives are simply easier to startle. Their system basically conveys to them a greater startle reaction. That's a bigger amygdala reaction. That's, for technical reasons, what this really amounts to is, if you know something about Tenenberg and animal behavior, it's not about actually a more active amygdala. It's about a less effective system or a less active system for down-regulating the amygdala. So what liberals have, and this is part of what we're tracking with the brain study people to get a clear handle on, but what apparently liberals have is they have a better system for down-regulating their amygdala, for being less concerned about outside issues, both as something as simple as startle and something as intellectually elaborated as their position on immigration or on national defense. And again, the notion here is that what do genes do? Do genes give you a position on national defense? No. Do genes give you an amygdala that's not as down-regulated as somebody else? And then in a particular cultural environment and with all the intellectual elaboration we can imagine, do they make you more susceptible, in the same sense that genes might make you susceptible to cancer? Are you susceptible to liberalism, or are you susceptible to conservatism? Depending on which of those you think of as cancer, you can take your pick either side, and you've got the susceptibility model. But interestingly enough, this research is completely reviled by both the left and the right. So I've been on numerous right-wing talk shows in which they assume that this is all just a liberal excuse. As one, I think it might have been Rush Limbaugh said, that isn't this just basically the liberals' way of saying, you know, I'm just a puppy dog, I can't help peeing on the carpet. This is sort of the typical, I can't be held responsible because my genes made me pee on the carpet or something. And then of course liberals say, isn't this basically just Nazism? Isn't this basically just, you know, isn't this basically just genetic, you know, sort of, a complete defense for basically killing people on the basis of their genes or breeding a better type of people? Or doesn't this mean that basically all humans are not perfectible? And I think probably it does mean that, but you know, sort of in the interest of full disclosure, I am a liberal, and Rush Limbaugh was exactly right. I used to be ashamed of it, but I'm not anymore, because like a puppy who pees on the carpet, I've got some liberal genes. I can't help that. I suspect my father had nothing to do with my conception whatsoever, and so as a lucky consequence, I happen to be a liberal. I have lots of friends who are very conservative, and I used to think that maybe they just weren't quite, you know, wired up right, and I now realize they are just wired up perfectly. They're just wired up differently, so I don't resent them being conservative anymore. They continue to, I spoke recently to a conservative reporter for a very conservative national magazine who was writing up something incredibly derogatory about this work, and talked to me, and he said, you know, I talked to Evan Charney, and he says this is all just a bunch of crap, and what's your defense for that? And I said, he said, I'm going to publish like all Evan stuff, so you may as well get your chance to say something. And I said, well, that's good. I think this is it's healthy to have a debate about this. Evan's got his point of view, I got my point of view. This gives people a chance to think about these things. And he said, you liberals sicken me. He said, this This is exactly what's wrong with you liberals. What do you mean it's healthy for heaven? Heaven says horrible things about you. Why do you say that's a good thing? But do you not believe in this work? I said, well, of course I believe. We wouldn't publish the work. You believe. So go then act like you believe in it. It's not a good idea to have Evan running around saying this stuff is a whole bunch of crap. It isn't a bunch of crap. You know that. Why don't you just stick up for your stuff, right? Why don't you just say, look, publish my stuff or just take me out of the article? Why do you always say, the intellectual, the people will debate and this will be debate's a good thing. What the hell is that a good thing, right? If you think it's true, basically said, be a man, right? If you think it's true, start acting like it, right? Quit saying all this namby-pamby stuff. So, and I apologize for saying namby-pamby stuff. I say, I'm sorry, but, I'm a liberal. If this is upsetting you, talk to Evan. It's, all right. Oh, okay, so how does this whole biological thing take place? Well, it's complicated, right? It's just social scientists. I'm not telling the social scientists in the audience anything new. The other side of campus, you know this too. You do hard work and it's complicated. So it involves brain parts and genes and neurotransmitters and technical stuff. And then there should be and it's a Rube Goldberg thing. Why is it a Rube Goldberg? This is really important about evolution, right? Evolution is incredibly stupid. This is why, the whole notion of sort of creationism is about intelligent design, because evolution is not intelligent. It just randomly kind of picks stuff that's already hanging around and then, knocks it up to do something else with it. And it's just dumb. And so it builds all these Rube Goldberg devices like down-regulated amygdalas related to sense of smell or something. And, these are really goofy processes, and any freshman in computer science could devise a much better system for governing behavior than this goofball junk DNA leads to neurotransmitter stuff. But anyway, we're stuck with that, and I couldn't find a picture. By this point, the charm of PowerPoint was wearing off. So, all right, so here's the bottom line. When we think about variable human ideology, or variable anything else, right, this is what you're getting biologically is a predisposition towards something, right, so that you have this sort of predisposition toward it. And then we have these elaborated political ideologies like Marxism or libertarianism or something. And what's the real origin of those things? They're sort of cultural elaborations of what are basically gut reactions. So there are things like how high do we jump when we hear a loud noise. There are things like how active is our insula in producing disgust toward other human beings, and may motivate something like segregation. There are things like the part of our brain that is responsible for the degree of our literalism, something that if you know something about autism or borderline autism, Asperger's syndrome, you know that these are people whose brains are extremely literal. So that if they look at some text and read it, they assume it means exactly what it says. So if it says, only 15 things in line, then it's only 15 things. It doesn't matter if it's a hurricane. If the line says 15, it's only 15, right? They're very literal, very literal. If you hear one of these people talk about how they understand a piece of text, like they give paragraphs to them, in which the meaning is obviously not literal, right? So it's social sciencey, right? The meaning is not literal. It's full of nuance and metaphor and stuff. And so they read this and they give you back the literal interpretation, and they don't give you the metaphor interpretation. And then you explain to them what the metaphor interpretation is, and they say, well, that's kind of stupid. Right? So why write it that way instead of writing what you literally meant? Wouldn't that be a better, clearer way to communicate? Why not just assume things are what they actually say? If you followed the Supreme Court recently, you'll recognize that that what's called textualism or strict constructionism sounds an awful lot like a brain that is if you think of brains on a spectrum, as they now have an autism spectrum. Clearly, there's one side of that spectrum, what's called autism, in which the brains are built to interpret literal information literally. And then, of course, what that's elaborated with is a whole theory of why that's a better idea. Well, it's easy to come up with a better idea for why you should interpret things literally if you can only interpret things literally, right? So you can only read things literally, and you say, what's so bad about that? That certainly makes sense. After all, you don't have all these things that are bad about sort of liberal, loose interpretation. The other end of that syndrome, there's actually a syndrome at the other end in which people basically they can't take anything literally. Anything literally. My sister suffers to a large degree from this with regard to the law, interestingly enough. And bless her heart, she is a great person, but she takes the entire text of federal, state, and local law to be suggestions, and she offers the interpretations of them. And she has interpretations of the tax code to explain to me why certain parts of the tax code apply only to wealthy people. and that she's not a wealthy person, so they were not meant to apply to her. She understands what the tax code writers were thinking about when they wrote it. And if they weren't thinking about her, she just ignores that part of the tax code. Okay? She ignores traffic laws. She understands the purpose of traffic laws. There's certain conditions it might be important not to go fast, or it might be important to stop somewhere. There are other conditions which clearly they didn't mean for you to stop there when there weren't other people there. So she doesn't. Right? This is again, I don't think that she learned this. You know, when I grew up in a military family, I don't think she learned this around the house, unless it was just simply to piss off my dad. But I think she has a brain in which nuance and metaphor, right? So you think about all the wonderful things about having a brain like that, in which you see a million different interpretations in everything you see. That can be a really wonderful thing, but it may not be the best way to interpret the Constitution, right? Nonetheless, if that's the brain you've got, that may be the way that you interpret the Constitution. And you may find that to be something you would think is laudatory and be willing to teach law students, for example. And so here we have something that's a very elaborated political construct, like textualism, that may in fact have very simple origins in the nature of what people can actually do with their brains. This, by the way, for those of you who have ever taken an economics class, this is the entire explanation for the economics department, something which is otherwise inexplicable. The economics departments are composed almost entirely of non-neurotypicals. Whereas to most neurotypicals, economics looks like an interesting use of sort of strict theory to offer a kind of idealized view of human behavior. To most economists, it doesn't look like that at all. It looks like an actual explanation for how actual humans behave. So there's a wonderful little divide the dollar game you may be familiar with when you give someone $20 to divide with some other anonymous person they've never met before. Most people will give the other person half the money. Economists have been running this experiment. They've now run the experiment in excess of 10,000 times just to see if maybe people would stop doing that. In one famous example, an economist ran the experiment, and in the instructions to the subjects, they included in very large, bold type, "You would be doing us a favor if you only considered yourself in making this decision." This is, you know that you're desperate when you put an instruction like that in a protocol for an experiment. And guess what? It reduced the rate of sharing in this thing by about 20%, and the modal response was still to give the other person half the money, even though you were told. It's like, for God's sake, use your brain. Right? Your brain tells you to give the other person nothing. Right? But people just don't do that. Well, at least the conclusion of economists is that this is a complete failure. They're stunned by these experiments. It's a complete failure because the modal response is to give away half the money. One of the things they've overlooked, which I think only an economist would overlook, is that between 25 and 30% of people do exactly what economists say they will do. They durably keep all the money. They keep all of it. So you give them $20, they keep $20. You say, why'd you keep the $20? They say, because you gave me the $20. I don't know this other person. And you say, okay, we'll modify that experiment. We'll give the other person a veto over the allocation. So you propose how much to give the other person, then the other person can either say yes or no. And the first, if that 20%, 25%, the first question they'll ask is, so what's the smallest amount I can give them? And you say, okay, so we'll do it by pennies. So you can give them as little as a penny, or you can give them as much as $20. They'll say, okay, I'll give them a penny. And you say, okay, what do you think the other person's going to do? And they say, they're going to say yes. Because if they veto it, everybody goes home with no money at all. Right? So you say, so why won't they veto it? Well, because 1 penny is more than no penny. Right? Do you understand, like, transitivity? Right? It's like one of those numbers is bigger than the other. People always take more money rather than less money. Like, what part of economics did you fail? Right? Human beings have some basic level of self-interest. If you say, here, you choose which hand you take. This hand has no money in it. This hand has a penny in it. Which do you take? You take the one with the penny, right? So they predict that everybody who is offered the penny will accept the penny. And you know what? 75% of the people just say, in the words of one of these economists, and you can't do better than economists, he said, the minimum amount that you can allocate in the equation for this is defined as epsilon, because there are Greek names for everything in economics, because there's math for everything in economics. So he said, in writing this up, he said, it's almost as if the second player is saying, take your epsilon and shove it. Okay? Which is, of course, exactly what the second player is saying. Like, you got $20 to divide between us, you're giving me a penny, you're taking $19.99. Now, actually, you're going home with nothing. Okay? I'm more than willing to spend a penny to tell you what a jerk I think you are. Right? Again, what the economists miss that's interesting about this is about 20 to 25% of people take the penny. They don't veto it. They take the penny. And if you ask them why they take the penny, they say, because a penny is more than nothing? I mean, like what part of economics did you fail, right? I got more, the guy gave me a penny? I can't believe it. Why didn't he give me nothing? If you know anything about the equation, what do economists predict you would do if you were given nothing? Suppose the other person took the whole $20 and then say, okay, it's up to you. You can either approve or veto this allocation. What would an economist expect the person to do? The person is indifferent. Remember, if the person vetoes it, they get nothing. If they accept it, they get nothing. The economic person is completely indifferent between those two states. And so the economists actually assign a probability of 50% to rejecting the allocation. Because you're completely indifferent. You don't know how to decide. It's like, I don't know, what do I care? Flip a coin. What do I reject, accept? I don't care. I get nothing either way. Right? Well, that, for about 20-25% of the population, most of whom are destined to be economists of some form or another, that makes perfect sense. Different kinds of brains, built different ways, produce a different theoretical view of human nature, because a lot of our view of human nature is necessarily self-reflective. So if you're in the neurotypical part of the population, you find economists and economics to be sort of interesting, perhaps even charming if you like theory, but amazingly remote from the real world. But the interesting thing is that there is a substantial proportion of our population for whom classic economics is a precisely correct description of individual human behavior. Now, fortunately for large-scale human behavior, the modal group is the group that in fact actually cooperates, shares, does all the kinds of things that we see people doing, for example, in disasters of the sort we have. And then what's left beyond these sort of predispositions to be, in this case, selfish or generous, whatever, is basically what our incredible rationalizing brains can whip up as a justification. Right? So one way of thinking about this is that virtually the entire corpus of economics is a giant rationalization for having a brain like an economist. And to be fair to economists, virtually the entire corpus of everything else in the social sciences is a giant rationalization for what it's like to not be an economist. Right? Now, you got to give credit to the economists. They have economic brains, and they've got an entire mathematical theory of it that is actually quite impressive. And the rest of the social science has non-economic brains, and they haven't got a thing. They have got no real empirical information. They've got no elaborate mathematical model. They basically are just sort of floating around somewhere. So in case you think I just don't like economists, I love them. I think they're quite interesting. Anyway, I think we often confuse rationality and rationalizing. Yeah, we're not doing that. No, too small. Oh, this is kind of fun. What emotion is this person experiencing? Well, it's, this is called an eye reading test. Simon Baron Cohen developed most of this and used it elaborately to diagnose autism spectrum, depending on where you are in the autism spectrum. And this is kind of a roughly normal distribution. You may either be, if you're in the middle, like most people, you're fairly good at this. If you're toward the autism end of the spectrum, you're not very good at this. And if you're at the sort of Murphy syndrome end, you're incredibly good at this. You're a savant at picking out people's emotions. It turns out that conservatives are statistically worse at doing this than our liberals. And one of the people that we work with in this project, I mentioned Nick Martin, who's a behavioral geneticist at Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. When we were putting this into a twin study we're doing down there, he said, oh, this looks like a lot of fun. The twins will love this kind of thing. He said, this is really neat. They'll love this, because we're always asking them questions. The last study they did was on suicide. They had a battery of over 100 questions on details. So now, thinking of the last time you attempted suicide, did you do that by putting your head in an oven, putting a gun to your head? It was just incredible. The kind of stuff that you can imagine. How painful is that to fill out? Let's see, because of the last time I tried, like, checking that off. So instead they get this, like, guess emotions from looking at eyes, and suddenly they're having a better day. So Nick is really excited about this. Nick is also the most conservative person I've ever met in my entire life, as well as being a genius, which I think if you think, if liberals sometimes think conservatives aren't smart, conservatives sometimes think liberals aren't smart, Nick and I are both smart. So there you go. So Nick is immediately thrilled by this. He wants to see it on the computer. He gets on the computer, he runs through the thing, he looks at the score, and he, like, one of the worst scores I've ever seen, lower than probability on the eye reading test. And he said, well, there's something wrong with this test. We can't use this. What's wrong? Let me see the scoring algorithm. He goes through the scoring algorithm, all this kind of stuff. He said, are they sure? Who said that these were the right answers? Right? Well, no, he said, I just don't believe this. We said, well, I mean, we've done this in 2 different locales with 2 different sets of people, and it durably helps predict liberalism and conservatism. He says, I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. It can't be. How can I get a 0 on it if it's like any kind of a measure of conservatism, right? I don't know, Nick, but go home and think about it for a while, and maybe this will start to make sense to you. So again, reading eyes is something that some brains are good at. Dogs' brains, for example, are really good at this. Foxes' brains are really bad at this. So if you've ever had a dog as a pet, you'll know that the dog reads your emotions very quickly. They read your emotions to a large degree through focusing on this part of your face. If you black this part of the face out, for example, dogs are not good at reading emotion. Dogs address this. That is, if you look at where your dog's looking, and your dog looks you in the eye. Right? There's a wonderful book if you want to read about what it's like to be someone with Asperger's syndrome. There's a wonderful book called Look Me in the Eye, written by someone who has Asperger's syndrome and spent their entire life as a child being yelled at by school teachers, principals, whatever, policemen saying, look me in the eye. It's very difficult for Asperger's people to attend to that. It's also very difficult for foxes, for example, to attend to that. Foxes don't look people in the eye very much. They are not very good at reading eye emotion. They're not good at reading directional gaze. So if I put food in one bowl and cover it up and there's no food in the other bowl and I look toward the bowl with the food, what will my dog do? Much better than chance my dog will follow my eye gaze. My dog will look at me, see what I'm looking at, go over to the bowl and to get the food. Right? If I do the same thing with a chimpanzee is like about 800 times as smart as a dog in a sort of a strictly physics sense. Chimpanzees have an amazing sense of physics, which I think is really brilliant that they understand physics. So chimps are really good at physics, and if I do this with chimps, what do? But by and large, they don't do well on this. Some chimps that have spent a lot of time around people are a little better at it than others. But for the most part, chimps don't do any better than chance at following eye gaze. They're not good at following eye gaze at all. If I do this with a wild Siberian fox, does the fox do better than chance? They don't. If I do this with a Siberian fox that's been bred for 40 years simply for tameness and human approach, they read it just as well as a domesticated dog. How long does it take to get from a wild Siberian fox to a domesticated dog? It takes 40 years. It takes 40 generations to get from a wild animal that cannot read eye gaze to a completely tame animal that can read eye gaze, that can actually, in which you can exchange shared joint information of a collaborative nature. You can share that with a dog, you can't share it with a fox, you can't share it with a chimp, at least not with chimps as they exist as present. In any case, so this varies. It varies across the human species. Some people are better at this than others. Some people are better at eye gaze. Interestingly enough, we can make people better at this test. If we blow oxytocin up your nose, you get better at this test for about 30 minutes. And then you go back to about where you were before. And interestingly, you can also recognize the people you saw in the pictures. So if you're a high-functioning autist, you not only can't recognize the emotion, but if I show the picture again and say, was this one of the eye pictures you saw, you won't do any better than chance at guessing if it was one of the pictures you saw. But if I give you oxytocin, for 30 minutes you'll do a better job on the test, and a week later you'll say, I saw that person in that eye gaze thing. Well, the ability to recognize people you've seen before, social life is much more fluid and seemingly natural if you know that you've seen someone before. Right? This is the fact of constantly being introduced to people as strangers you've never seen before is really not a very good way to move through a cooperative social existence. So this again is something that is genetically variable across humans and across animals as well. And so now we're just going to finish this up real fast. No. Look at that. Is that a great picture? What is this mouse doing? The mouse is actually sniffing and licking this cat. And that's not a really good thing for a mouse to do. These researchers specifically chose domesticated cats because you may not be aware of this, but domesticated cats have lost completely the ability to hunt mice. Okay, so wild cats, even feral cats, regain some of this. They hunt mice by scent, and that the scent of mice causes them to go into hunting mode, and then they hunt them by scent. Domesticated cats don't have a scent instinct for mice, and they will hunt them only if they see them moving, and then they will only play with them. And very careful experiments have showed that, in fact, if you put cats in businesses, which was done in New York to reduce the rat and mouse population, what happens is the cats do reduce the mouse population wherever they're put because the mice can still smell the cats and they go somewhere else, but the cats don't actually kill any mice. The mice just smell the cats and go somewhere else. This mouse obviously cannot smell this cat in a way that would suggest fear. What was changed in this mouse, a single gene was knocked out. It's the gene that builds a particular group of a very small number of receptor cells in the olfactory bulb of the mouse that allows the mouse specifically to smell cat. And they refine this to a single chemical that cats give off, present in cat urine as well as in the paws of cats. If these 7 or 8 cells are intact and working, it smells that particular scent, and those cells, unlike the rest of the cells in the olfactory bulb, connect directly to the amygdala. The amygdala fires off, and the mouse, it scares the bejesus out of the mouse. You can do this with mice if you have this little scent that you can buy from a commercial biological firm, and you have your little pet mouse, whatever, and you open the little stopper, and the mouse just goes berserk because this says cat, and it goes straight to the amygdala. All the other scents also have a path to the amygdala, but it's indirect, and because it's indirect, for example, you can condition a cat to be afraid of a lot of things. You can condition a cat to not be afraid of a lot of things. A mouse. A mouse that has this intact gene cannot be conditioned to be unafraid of cats. It is impossible to train them to be unafraid of cats because you can't get to the privileged connection between those sensory cells and the amygdala. You can only get to the indirect ones. Once you knock that out with this gene, you can train this mouse to be profoundly afraid of cats on smell. You can train this mouse to do all kinds of other things, but in its untrained state, this mouse simply approaches cats like it would approach another mouse. It's friendly to them. Right? So here we have a sort of outsider, a very profound change in how outsiders are approached. You can see the evolutionary value for mice having that particular set of cells because it protects them from cats. But this is something, and interesting, this sort of privileged path to the amygdala is something that humans have for a variety of scents as well. And I'll just give you one example before I stop, and that is humans have a variety of genes that control our sense of smell. There's one of those genes, a single gene, that can exist in two states, so they're actually alleles. This is a gene that does vary across humans, even though it's actually a protein encoding gene. If you have one form of that gene and you're given a little whiff of the main component of human sweat and asked to describe it, the most common words used to describe it were urine was one of the most common. If you have the other form of the gene, the most common descriptor was either vanilla or ginger. Now, it strikes me that those are quite different responses to the smell of another person. That is, if by and large, as you approach other people, you get kind of a whiff of urine, I suspect that makes approach and all kinds of other things very different than if you get a kind of a whiff of sort of vanilla or ginger. I take the very terms used to describe this to indicate just how it is that conservatives become somewhat suspicious of strangers and liberals think that they are basically scented candles, and therefore they just basically say, of course I want to negotiate with foreign dictators because they smell like ginger. And we're going to relax together, and we're going to achieve world peace. And of course, for conservatives whose brain and olfactory system is intact, they're large cats, right? This is a really stupid idea because if you go there and they can get away with it, they're going to pounce on you, right? So again, these are very deep-seated reactions. Can you overcome this intellectually? Can you put this behind you? Of course you can, but it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to sort of elaborate on this than it is to actually overcome it. So this is just like there's a gene, for example, that makes you instantly addicted to nicotine. You may have seen this recently. So if you have a particular allele of this gene, the first time you smoke a cigarette, you are addicted to nicotine, the first time. For most people, you're not. They don't have that form of the gene, and they have to smoke for a long time, right? So how easy is it to get addicted? How easy is it to quit smoking? If you were addicted physically to nicotine, one of the most addictive drugs known to man, the first time you smoked a cigarette, it's not going to be easy for you to be a non-smoker. And other people say, hey, what's the big deal? You can take them or leave them. I smoked for a while, I quit. So quit, right? Well, yeah, you smoked for a while and quit because you weren't physically addicted to nicotine, or your nicotine addiction system was down-regulated compared to mine, right? So these fundamental differences contribute to behavioral differences. They're important things, and I think that's, I can't show you the foxes, but that's lovely stuff. There's a picture of a brain, in case you thought we weren't doing real brain research. There's a bar graph. You should always have bar graphs. 9/11 made the entire United States more conservative, and in fact, if I take our standard ideology questionnaire, and I proceeded by having you match pictures, and those pictures are flowers, and some other people match pictures that are gravestones. The people who match gravestones will answer all the questions, including questions about gay marriage, everything else, more conservatively than the people who match flowers, because for about a half hour, if you're given a mortality stimulus, you suddenly, something liberals are not aware of, you suddenly recognize that you could die, the world's a dangerous place, and you actually start trying to enact policies that might protect something. Whereas for liberals, their life is basically, their natural state is like, I just looked at flowers, and conservatives' natural state is, I just saw my own death. And so that's a different thing. It's something like 9/11, as you might guess, has a pretty profound effect. And so liberals and conservatives all become more conservative following that. You may have noticed that in U.S. politics or not, depending on how aware you are of that. Segregation is mostly discussed. Liberals have no sense of purity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There we are. All right. I think we're done except for questions, perhaps even more done than that.
Maybe we'll just take 5 minutes for questions because we have a reception waiting as well.
Yes?
For the study of fraternal twins, did that include twins of different genders?
No. So one of the obvious things that you want to be careful about is that and this is something not everybody's aware of, but in case you aren't, monozygotic twins, which are clones, cannot be opposite sex. Okay. Being identical precludes the possibility of being opposite sex. There's actually a biological difference between males and females, and so identical twins are always the same sex. People often ask this about opposite pair twins. They say, oh, are they identical because they look a lot alike? And the answer is, no. Okay. Short answer is no. So because DZ twins, like other siblings, can be opposite sex pairs, the opposite sex pairs are all dropped. So you're always comparing equally alike in terms of gender. It's a good question. Yes?
Often people tend to shift away from liberalism and towards conservatism as they age. Has this been studied in accordance with biological?
It's right. There is a correlation between age and conservatism, and there are a lot of complicated explanations for that. The simplest explanation that we have now that's compatible with data is if, for example, I ask you if you have life insurance, and then I give you a questionnaire of political items, you'll answer it more conservatively than if I ask you what kind of car you have.
So is it really
one of the things I've noticed as I've gotten older is that the mortality prompts are much readier. So like every time I look in the mirror, I get a mortality prompt. So my view of that is that one of the things about getting older is even if you're a liberal, you start to actually experience these mortality prompts, that you recognize that you're going to die. And because that is your potential that you, as improbable as it may seem, that you were actually going to die, which doesn't seem very improbable to conservatives, seems quite improbable to liberals. But the fact that you might actually die then should make you more conservative, and in fact it does. So my argument would be there may be something else going on there in terms of other kinds of effective aging. But what you would have to lay aside first is the possibility that just simply something you would have no clue about, but which some of us who are older would. Right? As you get older, mortality is, you think more about things like life insurance. Like, how often do you think about gravestones? Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I'm like picking one out, okay? So I got to write a check every month to pay the headstone company to reserve my plot or whatever. So every month I get the shock and I become more conservative, and you don't have to worry about that.
But couldn't it be that things like oxytocin levels go down? Has anyone actually looked to see if oxytocin goes down as you age?
Yeah, the other thing is, of course, we all have standing levels of oxytocin. They do vary across individuals. We in fact know that by looking at people's natural state of oxytocin, we can predict things about them. We can predict things across countries. Countries where economies work better tend to be countries in which the resting level of oxytocin in the population is higher, and therefore they're more trusting. It takes a lot of trust to make a modern economy work. Otherwise, you think, geez, my entire retirement accounts with Merrill Lynch or Lehman Brothers. You might not believe that was a good idea if you didn't have trust, and without that, of course, the whole economy could collapse. So there clearly are those. And by the way, if you want to boost the only thing that we know of that boosts blood levels of oxytocin is legumes. So if you eat more beans, it boosts your blood levels of oxytocin. Now, unfortunately, there's no evidence that oxytocin from the blood actually crosses the blood-brain barrier. That's the reason why we squirt it in people's noses. The olfactory bulb, which is a part of your brain, actually protrudes into your nasal cavities, the only part of your brain that's exposed to air. And so if you want to get something into your brain very quickly, I'm not telling many of you something you don't already know. You can apply this intranasally. By the way, it's illegal to do research using intranasal oxytocin in the United States. So I can buy and give you oxytocin in the intravenous form. It's available in any pharmacy. It's perfectly legal. And if most women who've ever had a child have had oxytocin because that's what Pitocin is. And so it's used to induce labor. It's used for other things. But in the United States, you cannot legally apply oxytocin through people's nose. And it's because the intranasal application of pharmaceuticals is specifically banned in the United States. You can do this anywhere in Europe or Australia. So Australia is where we're actually doing this research because they are just not quite as concerned about the possibility about intranasal application. But you also, if you are interested in this, you can buy Pitocin, which is just liquid oxytocin, from pharmacies in Canada. They'll ship it to you. You then dump out a nasal quart applicator, rinse it with water carefully, fill it with oxytocin, and then you can medicate yourself. There's an entire website that you should look at. This is called Docin-Tocin. And I'm saying this just because I know a lot of you are Rice students, and I can tell you if you go to the website, you'll discover that a lot of people who are kind of like Rice students find themselves kind of experiencing social awkwardness, and one of the views is that oxytocin helps make you less socially awkward. So this is, I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. There are people who actually use this before they enter social situations in order to make themselves sort of more like a neurotypical. And there's some anecdotal evidence that it might actually work. I myself, of course, don't recommend any of this. And I don't know if I mentioned earlier, it's illegal. Unlike my sister, I take those things to be fairly literal. So I think what the illegal part of this means is that you're actually forbidden from doing it on pain of criminal prosecution. So far be it from me to recommend such a thing. Yes?
You said earlier that our genetic predispositions are not sort of a end-all and that intellectual life can't help overcome that. Are there any studies on that education can actually help in terms of changing your opinions independently of your genes? Or does it just show that we're really good at rationalizing things?
Well, we are good at rationalizing things, and the more educated you get, the better you get at rationalizing things. This is what 90% of science passes for, is just really smart people rationalizing stuff. Or social science, I mean, not real science. But it's really important to remember, so I'm not a genetic determinist, although sometimes I pretend to be, simply because most people are environmental determinists, right? They say, okay, so environment is 50, 60, 70%, and they just take that to be everything, so genes don't matter. Genes matter a lot, but the bulk of that variation is still unshared environment. That means what happens to you as an adult, and the things you read, the decisions you make as an adult, the experiences you have in the adult world, make a big difference in things like ideology. So that's real. Those are real changes and real variations, at least for something like ideology. For other kinds of things like happiness and IQ, there's simply much less room for variation there. So the set point for happiness is quite strong. It's very difficult to overcome that. If you don't believe that, just look at lottery winners. A lot of people who play the lottery do that largely to win. This may surprise you, but they actually hope to win. When they do win, they are spectacularly happy. I mean, spectacularly happy. Like almost they die, they're so happy. And then a year later, they're almost uniformly about as unhappy as they were before, for a variety of reasons, but partly because a happiness set point is something that's very difficult to move around. If you're basically a happy person, it's very hard for it to move you away from that, although world events do. You end up back at that set point, and the same thing is true for people who are basically unhappy. IQ is similarly, because there's this fairly small room for environmental influence, it's a fairly durable thing. Luckily for the two political parties, there's at least 50% of ideology is there to be pushed around in adults, so there's still plenty of room for political campaigning to push you around either in the long run or the short run.
I don't want to, I hate to cut off questions, but I know that some people have to go, and we do have a reception out there that will allow you to ask your questions. So let me at this point thank John for an exceptionally rich talk. Yeah.
Remember what the word rich means in the social sciences. It's a very earthy. There's a very earthy connotation to rich in the social sciences.
Well, what I'm talking about is a talk that takes us from Pleistocene stories, which I'm very susceptible to because I teach human evolution, to fox domestication, to unendorsed applications of topical oxytocin to your nasal passages to reduce social awkwardness. So that by any, diverse and rich, by any definition of rich. I think it was a fabulous and very thought-provoking talk, and certainly for people who came expecting perhaps a more reductionist slant, it was a very nuanced argument that you presented and gave us a lot to think about. So I thank you for that, and I want to invite you all now to please come and have some food and talk some more with John if you have questions. Students, please do remember to put your response forms in the boxes, and if you were starting a student email listserv for Scientia, if you're interested, put your name on the list outside. Thank you all for coming, and we'll hope to see you next month. Thanks.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.